Good morning everybody, and indeed it is morning, quite early morning. I don't have all the time that I'd like today to do some proper sewing. Don't need all that for now. Thought it would rather unfair that I hadn't shown you any of this delightful stuff yet. A bit of mark stitch snipping. These are the back panels, which I'd only just cut actually the other day, rather than along with the front panels. This was due to my extremely blunt fabric shears, which I just couldn't bear to snip with any further. Yeah, I really do only have a couple of hours today, so I'm gonna skip the taping for now. I'll get on with it later, because I feel like both you and I will be more interested in seeing the fitting than that. Yeah, I think any of you who followed along the wedding suit series may remember that I neglected to do a proper fitting at this stage in that case. And while I'd done a toile fitting beforehand, so to test the pattern and whatnot, and had, done it to my satisfaction, I hadn't then refit it. And then by the time I got to doing the collar and the shoulders, due to some sort of faulty sewing, I ended up confusing things very much and causing lots of problems with the tightness of the collar and the neckline. And what's more, there was also the armhole situation where, I'd wanted not to necessarily disrupt the sort of chest fullness more than I needed to, and then just sort of snipped it freewheelingly during the construction of that particular jacket and never really got round to putting it back onto the pattern. So I'm basically starting again on that front. What's more, many of you may recall the torment that I endured during my sleeve setting episode. A lot of that was also to do with the rather excessive length of the sleeve cap itself in comparison to the armhole. So I'm hoping that I'll be able to find a way to basically enlarge my armhole without, having to lower it necessarily. So by basically scooping it more into the chest fullness, of which I think there's currently a good bit to spare. But we'll see, I think my sleeve pattern is a fundamentally good pattern. I can obviously make that smaller, and indeed I think I should do just for other reasons anyway, partially to solve this problem of sleeve being uncomfortably big for armhole. But yeah, it is a tale of two halves. It is a tango that takes two to do. So yeah, those are the sort of the main objectives today. Fit this properly, come away knowing what changes I need to transfer to the pattern, be ready to go. Et voila. I think that's how you say that. So yes, here they are, my wonderful pad stitch lapels. And in case, incidentally, anyone doesn't know what it was I was just doing, those mark stitches there, those little sort of white tacks, not dissimilar to these ones here. Indeed, exactly like these ones here. Imagine you have a sewing pattern for, I don't know, a quote-unquote normal garment like a shirt. It has its seam allowance already included. But then imagine that you wanted to add extra seam allowance on top of that, which is what I've done in certain places here. That's called inlay. I don't want to put that into the pattern, but what I do want to know is where the edge of the true seam allowance is. So the seam allowance that's in the pattern already, let's say 1 centimeter, as is the case in this case. So what those stitches represent is where the actual edges of the pattern were on the fabric, if that makes sense. So including the baseline seam allowance, but before I've added the inlay. So if you imagine I was cutting this out, the pattern is here, and the edge of the paper is where these tacks are, and then I drew on this extra inlay around it. And again, these tacks here, and also in some other places to mark specific important points, like pocket positions and things like that, they just help me know where it is exactly I need to sew. Because, for instance, when I sew this to the back piece, which doesn't have any inlay along this relevant edge, I'll know that I want the cut edge of the back panel piece to line up with these stitches and not with the edge, because this is just spare fabric that I'm saving in case I need it later down the line. Anyway, so speaking of seam allowances, what I'm just doing now is trimming the front edge of the canvas so that it leaves the actual garment fabric seam allowance free. So in other words, the edge of the canvas now is along where the actual stitch line is going to be when I put the facing on. And if you want to know whether I've been basically freehanding this, the answer is yes, I have. Rock and roll. Yoink. It always gets a bit confusing at the hem, to be quite honest, because I'm an idiot. All right then. So to be a little less enigmatic, what is going to happen today is I'm going to take the main panels, so this sort of front/side body unit that I've got here, which is now almost fully canvas. Again, there's going to be some taping going on here and around the front of the jacket, and I'm going to take that with the back panels, sew the back and side seams, sew the shoulder seams, put the shoulder pads in, and attach just the collar linen canvas part of the eventual collar. And I say so, I'm just going to baste it together, so not like permanent stitches or anything. I'm just going to use that to get an idea of how things are fitting, because I don't want to sort of finish the construction of the jacket, or put it all together, put the lining in and everything, and then find that actually I need to take it in by an inch at the waist, or the armhole, which I've already sewn a sleeve onto, is actually like way too tight and there's loads of bunching and all this stuff. Better just to check now. Let's do it responsibly. And as far as a morning's work goes, it's pretty pleasant, and you get the payoff at the end of actually, getting to put something on. Anyway, yeah, so you can see again about the inlay point I mentioned earlier. That's the inlay line there, and I'm sewing an extra 1 centimeter in here because the seam allowance in the pattern is 1 centimeter. So this is going to be the actual stitch line here, 1 centimeter in from that inlay edge. Yeah, and you can see here I've also tried to do a little bit of iron working around the shoulder blade area, as is customary, just to allow extra room for that pokey part of the body to move around. Yeah, so trying to do a not super tight, but also not super loose base here. You know, I want it to be holding together in a believable fashion and not just flopping around, pulling around, snapping apart. Really any of those things. Yep, so there's the basted back panel now. I'll just press that seam open and attach it to the front panels. Actually, before I do that, I'm just gonna baste back these seam allowances on the front edge of the front panels, just to kind of keep them out of the way. And also, obviously, I'll do the hems as well, but I'll do that when I've attached the front and back panels. Yeah, I'm not gonna bother folding over this top bit either. I mean, the collar's just gonna go under there. It's just that front edge of the jacket. It'll make it much easier for me if I can just have that accurately represented now. Oh, and this is extremely satisfying, actually. Look at that. That looks very handsome. If I may say so myself. I may, I will, and I did. Cool. Incidentally, if you want to know if I recommend doing a proper fitting at this stage in your construction, the answer is unequivocally yes. Yes, 1,000 times yes. You may feel like you're in too much of a hurry, you're too excited to get on with the actual construction and you'll just tweak it as you go. But I really mean it. Even if you have done a toile fitting beforehand, and especially if you did what I did last time and made changes to the pattern based on that fitting, but then not done a second toile fitting, and even then, even just making sure that with the canvas and any reinforcements you've done, with just the garment fabric itself and the way that might behave versus the toile fabric, it's definitely worth doing. It's really, you know, borderline essential. And it's definitely 100,000% the case if it's like a new pattern or one you haven't toiled or tested, or especially a commercial pattern. You know, maybe you're just going off the size as you would if you were shopping for a jacket, you know, your chest size. You know, especially the more sort of, if you like, fundamental issues of fit, how it fits around the chest, how it fits around the waist. You don't want to be leaving that until you've essentially already sewn those seams and, God forbid, started putting the lining in. If you want to know how I know all this, one word for it, and that word is experience. And you can have a little taste of it here, should you wish. I mean, even things just as trivial as weight fluctuations can suddenly throw things into disarray, and it really is just best to get ahead of them before you get too trigger happy with the machine, or before you close up your lining, for instance, by hand, only to unpick it and do it again. Okay, so enough doom and gloom. It's time to do the shoulder seams, and you may remember, or you may just happen to know, there's something fun going on with these, which is that the back panel's shoulder seam is, I think, 1.5 centimeters longer than the front panels, and that is so that I can ease that into the middle of the shoulder seam, and that's going to allow it to curve around gently towards the front panel on the shoulder to just sort of mimic a bit more the natural curve of the shoulder bones. Yeah, so I've just started on the neckline edge here, and I've pinned at the opposite end, at the armhole end, just the first inch or so of this shoulder seam. You can see here this excess on the back panel, and that is all just going to get eased around, distributed across the whole length of the seam, just by doing little kind of, you know, little bubbles. I'm not going to worry about getting it, I mean, obviously, well, there's no reason not to try and get it even here now. You know, if it's a little bit visually bubbly, that's kind of okay, as long as it sort of holds the shape that it's eventually going to have. And incidentally, both now and when it comes to the actual sewing of the shoulder seam, as you can see, I'm not taking the canvas with me. I'm just using the garment fabric, and the canvas is going to get rolled up. And eventually that will get sort of permanently stitched into the shoulder pad, which itself will get permanently stitched into the armholes, seam allowances, and things like that. Yeah, I've been a bit too lazy with this base, I think, so I'm just going to try and lock in these bubbles with some extra stitches. And indeed, when it comes to properly sewing the shoulder seam, I will press these bubbles out, so the ease will remain in the bit immediately on the inside of the shoulder beyond the seam that I will eventually sew. Within the actual seam itself, it will have been kind of pressed away, and it will just create this nice sort of voluminous effect. Again, just another little tailoring quirk that allows for a bit more three-dimensionality. Yeah, it's gonna be fun unpicking all this. It's worth the trouble. It's a very delicate effect, but you can kind of see how that wants to curve around now, banana-wise. So this being the back panel and this being the front panel. Not far now, almost done. Just attaching this inner linen collar piece, not colon. That would be rather painful. Yeah, so again, this is gonna go between eventually a piece of collar melton, which is sort of felt like wool on the very underside, and then on the top, obviously a bit of garment fabric. It's all just gonna be the same shape. And this is just this sort of structural, internal, central piece. Holds it together and allows it also to be shaped, because this has been cut on the bias, and you know, I've been able to contort it in order to account for the actual curvature of my neck, because, you know, it is indeed a curve and not a straight line, as people have alleged. Yeah, this has been a very satisfying exercise. I'm glad I've done this. I'm really looking forward to trying it on, seeing how it's panned out. Part of me feels like I should have some sort of moratorium on doing some random basty hand stitch step and then saying, oh, this is so satisfying. But then again, why refrain from playing the hits, eh? Such as they may be. What you would often see in an actual, I say what you would often see, I've literally never been part of one. You know, what you will often see in photos or videos of an actual professional bespoke fitting is, instead of the actual finished collar piece structure, just a sort of larger slab basically of this fabric, because then during the fitting you can on the fly basically modify the style and the shape of it according to, you know, what is desired or needed. I know that this collar style is what I want. I don't need to, you know, have that excess that I'm then going to trim away. But yeah, that is why mine looks like this, and others you may have seen look like that. But yeah, eventually, for instance, when I do a double-breasted project, which I think I will, 1 or 2 projects down the line, it might be that I take that approach and yeah, just start with a big flab and start with a big slab of collar linen and pare it down from there according to what I think looks nice. And of course, I can't forget these handsome devils. I know I've always been talking about how I'm going to make my own shoulder pads, but as it happens, this has now become a time-pressured project because I need to have it done in about a month, and I, you know, for something that I've never done yet as far as making shoulder pads is concerned, I'm not going to burden myself with it now. And I do really like these ones that I get from one of my local supply shops. They're good, you know, they work, and indeed the pattern is now basically oriented around the thickness that they have. So for now, at least, I'm not going to rock that particular boat. Yeah, again, not being especially precious about this either, just getting it roughly in the right place. So I tend to have the actual padded bit of these particular shoulder pads ending at the back pitch point on the back panel for where, you know, guiding where the sleeve is angled around. And yeah, it comes right up to what would be the cutting edge. So again, in this case, the line of my mark stitches here. And I'm really just gonna give it a few rough bastes through the top layer of the pad just to hold it in place while I'm trying it on. In the final garment, this is gonna go between the garment fabric and the, wait, no, it's gonna go between, where does it go between? I think it's gonna go between the, you know what, I've forgotten. I can't remember if it goes between the canvas and the lining or the canvas and the garment fabric. Well, we'll find out in a couple of weeks, won't we? Or else I'll check and put it in textually here. Ugh. Oh, come on. And there you have it, folks. Let's go try this bad boy on. I know I always say this, but overall I'm feeling pretty good about that. I mean, some of the same issues from the first time I fitted the last jacket, again, because I haven't actually retrofitted those pattern changes onto the pattern. You can see that kind of bunching coming out from under the collar. It's possible that's a sign that the neckline is just the tiniest bit still too tight. I might see about letting it out really just 1/2 centimetre or so, but it also might just be once I've properly put the shoulder seams in and pressed all that away and all that jazz, and indeed once the full collar is in and sort of holding its shape, that maybe that goes away in this case. I'll have a think about it. Yep, armholes, no surprise, they need to get opened up. I didn't just expect that I'd have to do that, I knew for a fact I'd have to do that. But yeah, you can just see that bunching around the chest, that isn't, you know, this sort of handsome ease, that is just the armhole trying to get away from my armpit basically, because there's not enough room for it to sit. I also kind of wonder if there's something slightly off with the balance. You know, that the grain line of the front of the jacket is maybe not going straight down, but is perhaps angling out a little bit, as if the fronts of the jacket wanted to sort of skirt away from the central line. And you can also kind of see there's almost this collapsing tendency in the lapels. I mean, the fact that I can't seem to decide for sure whether this is a problem leads me to think that I will just kind of not worry about it too much with this particular jacket, but it might be something that I investigate with the pattern going forward. If I'm letting things out around the neckline at the sort of shoulder seams, if I do make changes there, that's also maybe going to affect the balance. So I just need to bear that in mind, and it might be that I have to make another toile for the next jacket. We'll see. You can see the sort of roundedness of the back seam there. It's kind of creating these ripples up towards the back of the collar. Again, that's just because I sort of added this rounded shape to the back seam over my shoulder blades, essentially elongating the back seam. And obviously it was just kind of the wrong thing, or maybe just too much of the right thing. So I'll straighten that out again, and again, try and achieve that ease with a bit more ironwork maybe around the shoulder blades, and also perhaps experiment with tweaking the pattern in other ways to attain that. And indeed, both in the front panel and the back panel, you know, just essentially achieving a bit more of drape in the chest. But I'm gonna go and have a ponder and see if I can work it out. For now though, I think for this jacket, it's okay. It's snug, but it's, you know, it's not like it's gonna tear apart any of the seams or anything, I hope. Speaking of, as it were, it's possible that the waist could be taken in a touch more, actually. I mean, it's still, you know, the tiniest little bit loose. It could be a little bit more shapely. That's very straightforward. I can do that straight up on the pattern, and I'll just remember that when I'm sewing it, I just maybe, you know, overall 1 centimetre on each side on the waist, up to the waist notch and out again. I can do that. So I've just ran away there and tried to trim away a bit of the right armhole just to sort of compare and contrast. And yeah, I can feel and indeed see that that is much better. That bunching up isn't really happening there, and I've got more mobility. I think if there was even more chesties in the pattern, you know, if it was more of this sort of drapey English cut kind of thing, look at me acting as if I know what I'm talking about, then I could be even more greedy basically in what I were trying to cut away. It's lying neatly across my chest. There's still a little bit of room to move around, and it's not, you know, absolutely skin tight or anything. And I'll just see now when it comes to putting the sleeves on how it feels, and if I need to alter the sleeve itself rather than the armhole further, so be it. It's about time I bit that bullet. Well, the bells are tolling metaphorically for lunchtime over here, and that means I'm kind of running out of time for today. But I suppose it's worked out pretty well, and it feels pretty fun to have this on already. If you have any questions or indeed suggestions about what's going on here, please do throw them into the comments. And if, a bit like I did over the weekend, you find yourself lacking the lacking the juice to get down to your current sewing project or whatever you've got lined up next, and you need a few ideas on how to get going again, well, why don't you check this out? Otherwise, if you're only just checking in on the Summer Suit Diaries, you can find part 1 here.